Hello and welcome to the Blockchain and Us, where pioneers and thought leaders talk about their journey in blockchain technology, crypto assets, and the token economy. And I'm your host, Manuel Staggers. If you enjoy this podcast, please give it a top rating and review on iTunes, and feel free to follow me on Twitter at Manuel Staggers. This episode is brought to you by Descartes Finance. Descartes is the leading Swiss digital wealth manager, providing its products and services to individuals, family offices, charitable organizations, banks, and asset managers. Its investment strategies lead the way. They harness the largest know-how as only a digital investment advisor can. To learn more, please visit www.descartes-finance.com. My guest today is Steve Wilson, a digital identity innovator from Sydney in Australia. Steve has a double degree in physics and electrical engineering and has focused on digital identity and privacy since 1995. Steve is a vocal critic of many blockchain applications, especially in identity and health services. He holds several patents and is responsible for breakthroughs in identity infrastructure and governance, authentication frameworks, public key infrastructure, smartcards, digital credentials, fraud control, and privacy engineering, and he has advised national ID frameworks in several countries. Steve founded the Lockstep Group in 2004 and has been VP and Principal Analyst at Constellation Research since 2013, where he leads digital safety and privacy. And now, to the interview. Hello, Steve, and thank you very much for making time today.
Hey, Manuel. It's a great pleasure.
Steve, we already conducted 2 interviews in the past, and the last one was in Silicon Valley about a year ago. And recently I saw you wrote an article called Identity is Dead. Can you explain what this means?
Yeah, you bet. Look, clearly I'm being a bit provocative, but I'm calling on people to rethink what we're trying to do in identity management. It's been a long road to get almost nowhere in a lot of the grand plans for identity. We've been working on federated identity. And I should say that by federated identity, I mean the grand vision of having a much smaller set of identities where we can share identities between banking and government and healthcare. There was an expression of this ideal when the White House started its national strategy for trusted identities in cyberspace. Mm-hmm. At the beginning of the Obama administration, so we're going back 8 or 9 years, and the vision was that a student would be able to get up in the morning and use her student card to log on to her bank, or could equally use her bank ID to log on to her health system. So that was the vision, and it rolls off the tongue. It's something that we experience in social identity all the time. I can log on to all sorts of things using my Twitter handle, and that's pretty cool.
Mm-hmm, right.
But the grand plan of being able to share, let's call them serious identities across healthcare, government, banking, with a few exceptions, it's never happened. Absent legislation, it's certainly never happened. And NSTIC in the US, National Strategy, Trusted Identity in Cyberspace, went for 6 or 7 years and never quite achieved that goal. So that's what I mean by identity is dead. The idea that we can have a digital identity that is so powerful, to me, is something that just remains out of reach. It embarrasses me that every time the identirati have an argument or a debate about identity, we fall back to glossaries and definitions, and we talk about authentication and identity and attributes, and oh my God, it's fundamentally flawed. I don't think it's ever going to happen that way. And so when I say identity is dead, I mean, why don't we just kill the idea that identity could be constructed in this mythological way? Because it ain't happened for the last 10 or 15 years. And I think that we're wasting our time. So that's where I'm coming
Interesting. From. Yeah, it's a good point. I just, in the last few months, I've seen there were a few blockchain identity projects started in Switzerland. I mean, there's something called Zug Identity. There's several identity startups, that want to do. One is doing identity on the Bitcoin blockchain, and others use other blockchains. I mean, have you looked into those as well?
Look, I don't have an encyclopedic knowledge of these things anymore. There are so many identity blockchain ideas out there. And, I might have told you the story about how I first got into blockchain and identity, because 3 years ago, there was this strange phenomenon out there where every blockchain identity startup was really coming from a blockchain entrepreneur or a blockchain advocate.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And there were almost no identity people out there doing blockchain identity. I noticed that in 2015. I noticed that all of the blockchain identity fire and fury was coming from the blockchain side.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I remain very perplexed by most of these. I can talk about one or two identity distributed ledgers that do make a lot of sense, and that they're coming from a very balanced position. But there continues to be a perplexing number of startups that think that there's something about this immutable distributed ledger that in and of itself provides an identity solution, and a lot of it's misguided. Like, I have to say that most of what you read about the blockchain remains wrong, and most of what you read about blockchain and identity is often just full of category errors.
I mean, that has been your view for a while. I mean, in the last interviews I've heard or seen or read with you, you always described how people still misunderstand the idea what a blockchain really is and what it can do. I mean, in your view, why would using a blockchain be a bad idea?
Well, let's go back to what the original public blockchains were for. And they solved an unsolvable problem, which was Alice and Bob want to use cryptocurrency. They want to exchange real amounts of money between each other, but they want to do so in a decentralized environment without any intermediaries. And for about 30 years, we've had various forms of niche cryptocurrency which worked with digital intermediaries. The problem is double spend. You know, if I've got some digital money and I can copy it because it's just ones and zeros, how does the system stop me, bad Steve, copying my money over and over and spending it twice? So we always thought that you'd need some sort of cop, like an umpire or an intermediary to monitor every single transaction. And
those were the first eCash ideas, right? Where you always had somebody still looking at all the transaction and making sure that they actually are valid. Right.
eCash and DigiCash was the product name for something that was very clever and about 30 years old. Now, that was unpalatable to the libertarians, and the real sort of cryptocurrency geeks were always frustrated by that. And the interesting and powerful thing about Nakamoto's invention, coming as it did right in the middle of the financial crisis, was the community finds banking problematic, and the libertarians find banking completely distasteful. So they want to find a way of doing cryptocurrency just peer to peer.
Yeah,
and you still need to watch every single currency movement in the Bitcoin network. But what Nakamoto did was that they crowdsourced the surveillance of the crypto movements, and that was just genius. Not only crowdsourced it, but figure out a way of incentivizing thousands of computers to do this volunteer work.
With the miners.
With the miners, the Bitcoin miners are rewarded for turning a lot of computer cycles into looking after the network. So it was genius. Look, I have to say it was genius, but also as a thought experiment, it cracked the problem. It cracked that unsolvable problem. What's happened since Bitcoin is that there's been an enormous amount of innovation, and you and I talked about this. It was like the Wright brothers flyer.
Yeah.
People saw it. They tried to copy it. But a lot of really serious engineers looked more deeply at it and tried to replicate some properties of blockchain for the enterprise. So we've had R3 and Corda, Hyperledger Fabric especially, a lot of the new work being done by Microsoft and IBM, and a group called Hedera Hashgraph. These are really serious engineering projects that have replicated in a very sort of selective way some of the blockchain properties, and they're doing things that are, inspired by blockchain, but are really at the heart quite different.
So, but what these projects did, they tried to separate the currency from the blockchain idea, correct?
Yeah, they did. The newer ledgers in general are concerned with much bigger use cases than just cryptocurrency. Paradoxically, perhaps, cryptocurrency is a really simple use case. It's very simply stated. Alice and Bob want to exchange real value without any intermediaries. It's a very simple and actually a very special use case. It's special in the sense that a physicist will talk about a special case, not the general case. And the special case of cryptocurrency is very special. There's nothing like it in normal business. Normal business, you don't have the luxury of getting rid of intermediaries or getting rid of umpires or getting rid of standards and administration. So to that extent, cryptocurrency is really special. And, if we could get technical for a minute, not terribly technical, but
sure.
The challenge in most crypto systems, cryptography systems, is what's called key management. So I think people know that at the heart of a Bitcoin wallet is a thing called a private key. And the private key is your personal key into the system. It's a cryptographic code that needs to be safeguarded. You need to keep it in a Bitcoin wallet. Ideally, it's a piece of hardware, a hardware wallet that you keep secure. Maybe you protect it with a pin or whatever. But that's your personal key into the system. The amazing thing about Bitcoin is that nobody knows where the keys are. Nobody knows which person belongs to which key. In the original blockchain, it really didn't matter. And in a sense, it shouldn't matter because there was this total self-registration. So nobody knew which keys went with which person. If you happened to lose your key, then it was just understood that you were on your own. It was Wild West. Obviously, many people have lost their hard drives they've thrown them into the council tip accidentally. I've even got a pet theory that I think that Satoshi Nakamoto actually fried their own private key. I think that's the best explanation for why Nakamoto's fortune has never been spent. I think it's possible that Nakamoto lost their private key.
Really?
And had no recourse.
Well, it can happen to the best of us.
It can happen to the best of us. Now, in a way, I want you to imagine a sort of a swarm of private keys sort of out in the ether. There's tens of millions of these private keys floating around, and they command the movement of cryptocurrency from one key to another, to another, to another. And it's a wild sort of swarm, literally a swarm of private keys that do happen to be under the control of individuals, but nobody cares. You fundamentally don't care that Alice has a particular key or Bob has a particular key because the Bitcoin network sorts it out. It sorts out that through that possible chaos of cryptographic movements, Alice's key only ever gets used once per transaction, and cryptocurrency flows from Alice to Bob to Eve to Carol to Pete and so on. And the magic of blockchain is that it doesn't need key management. People self-enroll, they set up their own wallets, they load them up with money and away they go. Now it comes back to my idea that that's really special. There's nothing like that in normal business. There's nothing like that in healthcare, for example. I mean, you absolutely need to know that this patient Steve Wilson has a particular key, and you need to know that a doctor has a key and that a nurse has a key and that a medical researcher has a key. And you just don't have that sort of weird luxury of not caring whose key goes with which person.
That goes back to identity. We need to know people really are who they say they are.
Yeah, well, it does. And that's why this is sort of a long story, and I thank you for bearing with me. In identity, it's the exact opposite. Identity, you need to know who goes with which key. So the funny thing about blockchain, the original public blockchains, is that they're fundamentally unlike identity. If you've got a system that can tolerate that lack of key management and still move real money from one person to another, it's a special case. The reason why blockchain is so elaborate and so expensive, and the reason why it takes 10 minutes to decide that a transaction is valid is that you don't have key management.
Interesting point.
You come along with any use case. My favorite contra example is the refugee identity case. Giving digital identities to refugees is a keen problem, and I'm as energetically in favour of that as the next libertarian. we want to get people up to speed in the digital world. We want to close the digital divide. We want to get people engaged with banking. We want to get the unbanked connected to digital commerce. So there's this vague idea that blockchain is the way to do that. But when you dig into it, the way that people enact and live their digital lives is usually through a mobile phone of some sort. And that's great. That's real goodness. The mobile phone is a powerful tool for sure, and it needs some identity. But you know what? For a refugee to have a mobile phone, they need a mobile phone account. They need to be connected to a cellular network. And to get a mobile phone account, they need to be identified first. So the funny thing about most of the refugee use cases I see is that they start with a mobile phone, which means that they must start with identity before the blockchain comes along and does any magic. And once again, if you can solve key management, then I don't think you need the great big glorious public blockchains of Ethereum and Bitcoin. You may need a different ledger, and maybe we should talk about some of the identity management projects that are using new ledgers, and they're being quite clever and quite careful. But to rule a line underneath it, I just don't see that the public blockchains have the sort of properties, and they're just not engineered for the sort of problem that we have with identity.
Yeah, I see your point. I mean, I don't understand all of it. I'm not very technically versed. Mostly I focus on the stories, right, behind these phenomena. So, but still, what I understand is that you're saying it's very hard to separate the idea of currency from the public blockchains. And it's also very hard to mix on-chain and off-chain and put it together on the same blockchain.
Yeah, look, that's absolutely key. Most blockchain thinkers are at pains to tell you that blockchain and Bitcoin, for example, are different, and that distributed ledger technologies don't necessarily have a coin or a token, and all of that is true. But if you go back to the public blockchains, Ethereum and Bitcoin, separating the cryptocurrency is not simple. To me, it's a bit like trains and railway tracks. The train is technically separate from the railway track, but it doesn't do any good to separate those two things. They were designed to go together, and the truth is that Bitcoin and blockchain are so tightly joined together that you can't really tease them apart. You have to go back to the drawing board, which is exactly what people did at R3 when they created the Corda algorithm. They went back to the drawing board. Hyperledger Fabric is the same sort of exercise. So it takes some really serious engineering and some real brain power to make that jump to the sort of third generation technologies.
You also said in our blockchain interview, you mentioned that we should look out for blockchain version 4.
Yeah.
And that would really be the real innovation. And until then, there's a lot of trial and error and failing forward. So is that what you see happening now with these new distributed ledgers?
That was speculative talk on my part, that imagining version 4. And I don't pretend to be authoritative about these generations. I do think it's interesting that a couple of things have happened in the last 12 months that look like generation 4, and it's got more to do with governance and technology. So there's a couple of really powerful new projects that have merged governance and technology. One of them is the Sovereign Network. Was created initially by a company called Evernym in the US that has been rethinking identity and self-sovereign identity very carefully, and taking great care to solve a particular problem. And I think it's fair to say that Evernym and Sovereign are less concerned with identity now, even though they use the term self-sovereign identity. They're really much more concerned with the component attributes that make up somebody's identification. And the problem that's out there, the engineering problem with digital identity is really, how do you have confidence in the attributes? Think about KYC, know your customer in banking. You normally have to prove a number of things about yourself to open a new bank account anywhere in the world. You need to prove your legal name. You need to prove that you live somewhere solid. You need to prove your residency or your date of birth, or your country of origin.
Right. You have to hold up your
But all of those
passport next to the camera and your face and
Exactly.
all those things.
So all of those different factoids are only as good as the issuer. So, you need a quote-unquote official passport and you need a quote-unquote official birth certificate and a proof of residence. So there is an idea that some distributed ledger technologies can help at least record the fact of an attribute and perhaps record interesting metadata about an attribute. So who vouches for an attribute? When was it vouched for? How do you revoke an attribute? And how do you keep a really accurate timestamp record of the, let's say the life cycle of attributes? So a lot of interesting work is being done by Evernym and another company called Digital Bazaar. Some of the IP of Evernym has gone into a new foundation called the Sovereign Foundation, and in turn, a lot of the code has been donated to a new Hyperledger program called Hyperledger Indy. So it's an interesting ecosystem, and I don't know who the winner is going to be in all of this, and I doubt there will be a winner. I think there will be a continuing contest of ideas around how do you manage attributes, and what is the role of a distributed ledger for recording the life cycle of an attribute. So,
but isn't what you just mentioned, isn't that exactly combining off-chain, meaning this person really has a valid passport and notary X, proved that on this and this date, and therefore it is valid, and then it gets written into a blockchain? I mean, isn't that exactly mixing the off-chain and on-chain world?
That you make a really good point. These new algorithms, the plenum algorithm of Sovereign, and the work that Manu Sporny's done with Digital Bazaar, they're very conscious of the blend of off-chain and on-chain processes. So let's just remind ourselves about how important the off-chain thing is. When you look at Bitcoin, nothing really happens off-chain because it doesn't matter who belongs to which private key.
Right.
If Alice loses her key, then so be it. The only action is on-chain. It's a purely digital world. And it's quite different everywhere else in identity, in healthcare, in physical assets. If you're talking about land titles on the blockchain, what really matters is the link between the analog and the digital. So what is happening off-chain that allows a token or a digital representation on-chain to stand for anything physical? So if I've got a code on a blockchain that stands for a piece of land, or if I've got a code on a blockchain that stands for a diamond, how did that code get into the blockchain in the first place? It has to happen through an off-chain process. You need to have a trusted, usually a third party, sitting off-chain with a key, putting up their hand saying, here's a block of land and I'm putting it on the blockchain.
Yes.
There is no such process in the original Bitcoin blockchain. You don't need any trust. So the really weird thing is that if you're going to use the public Bitcoin blockchain for that type of use case, you're really creating an enormous overhead. You've got this proof of work algorithm that only exists because everything's purely digital. If you have an off-chain agent who's saying, I say that this is Steve Wilson's passport and I'm vouching for Steve Wilson's passport number, that person is the single point of failure in the system. And there's absolutely no point of then, farming out, outsourcing consensus to 10,000 computers on a public blockchain to crank away computing something about, Steve Wilson and his passport when there's a single point of failure off-chain. Now, so you're absolutely right that the newer algorithms, they don't have enormous networks of nodes that are cranking away establishing consensus, because really what matters is that you had an agent off-chain who was vouching for Steve Wilson's passport. So what's important is that we have some sort of robust, decentralized, distributed ledger that is secure and resilient and highly available to store those attributes and the attribute metadata. But the type of algorithm that's under the covers is really radically different from the old proof of work.
And also maybe then what's different is the promise of what a blockchain really is,
right.
I feel.
Yeah. the original blockchain was all about an immutable permanent ledger of every single currency movement, and you needed that because you needed an eye in the sky. But the identity applications are quite different, and the promise that you're looking for is really quite different. So I think that the modern algorithms are, and maybe this is the generation 4, we're hearing less about trust. We're hearing a lot less about immutability. These things have certainly got to be decentralized and highly available, and those are good properties. But the promises are different. Now we mentioned governance.
What are the new promises?
Well, a lot of this gets wrapped up in the new governance. So I'm seeing these fourth generation, arguably fourth generation. Maybe it's too early to make that call, but the sovereign network is made up of a number of stewards, so-called sovereign stewards, that have a role in the good housekeeping and the management processes that are occurring off-chain, as well as the software that keeps the chain itself together. So the sovereign steward network and the much newer algorithm, again, the hashgraph algorithm that is now being commercialized by a company called Hedera, these things are also got networks of governance agents and governance participants that are looking after the housekeeping of the network and keeping the network honest, if you like. And instead of having tens of thousands of volunteer miners that are really in it for the money in the Bitcoin network, these newer networks, the newer distributed ledger networks, are much more tightly governed by organisations that are perhaps going through a different economic model too. So it's early days, but as I understand Hedera, the stewards and the gatekeepers, let's call them in Hedera, are being remunerated for the services that they provide. So instead of having a random mining bounty, the stewards and the gatekeepers of the new networks are being paid for the work that they do. And that should, the theory is that should produce a much better behaved, less chaotic set of fluctuations and performance metrics as well.
Interesting. But what these blockchains you're describing, they're permissioned blockchains.
Absolutely.
Yes. And also then you have a network of, private agents that are for-profit companies maybe that basically maintain the functioning of these blockchains, correct?
That's the way it's emerging. That's right.
Interesting. When you look at what has happened there, have you maybe revised some of your views, that you had originally on innovation, if you want to call it that, in the field being somewhat misguided? Have you updated maybe some of your views on this recently?
I think at the upper end of the scale, there's a lot of really good work being done by some very smart people who know exactly what's going on, and they're still continuing to engineer governance systems and algorithms that are really interesting for much broader application than just cryptocurrency. At the same time, there's an enormous number of entrepreneurs that are still absolutely using the public blockchains, Bitcoin and Ethereum, for a whole range of use cases. And I continue to say that the vast majority of those use cases are misguided. You just don't put on a public immutable ledger the sorts of stuff that normally belongs in a database.
Yeah, right.
Health records and identity and physical asset ledgers just don't belong on that type of data structure. So, look, I absolutely salute the really good work that's being done by R3, Hyperledger, Microsoft, IBM, Hedera Hashgraph, Digital Bazaar, Ebenim. Brilliant people doing good work, and most of them are still very modest about where this is heading. You talk to the big professional services firms, and they will say that roughly 80% of blockchain pilots or distributed ledger pilots are going to end without, they're going to end and go on and do something else.
Yeah.
I'm trying not to say fail, but, by some measure, you could call them a failure. If you think that blockchain's a good idea and you do a pilot and it turns out to not be a good idea, then I don't know what you call that. Maybe people are failing fast, and there's nothing wrong with failure. There's nothing wrong with experimentation if you learn from it.
Yeah, absolutely.
So the figure I keep hearing is 80%. If you look at across all of the proofs of concept and so on, 80% of them will turn out to change their mind about the distributed ledger. And that's because...
That's interesting, isn't it?
It's because this is a special purpose technology. Yeah, it's very interesting.
Cool. So basically they'd end up using just a database and encryption, and that will do just fine instead of using a blockchain, you mean?
Yeah, exactly. If if you're in a use case which is highly administered and there's a lot of off-chain processes, a lot of off-chain reliance occurring, then the sort of promise that you get out of a distributed ledger, out of a blockchain, it's just not adding a lot of value.
Yeah.
Let me talk about health records for a minute
Sure.
and consensus. So I saw a demonstration of a health record on a blockchain, and the people demonstrating it were not fools, and they were not, to be fair, keeping health information on a blockchain. They were keeping hashes of a health record on a blockchain, and the purpose of the blockchain in their case, I think, was to store some metadata about the life cycle of a patient's consent. So the patient sits down with the doctor. They do some tests. The doctor says, would you like your record to be kept in this new technology? And blah, blah, blah. A hash of the encounter is produced and digitally signed and popped on the blockchain. Now, I was interrogating the engineers and saying, why are you using a public blockchain? What's the consensus mechanism, or what's the consensus objective? And they said, well, we've got the consensus between the doctor and the patient that this particular thing happened at a particular time, and we're putting that on the blockchain. And I said, so this is a public blockchain with a number of nodes all reaching consensus about that event? They said, absolutely. We're using Ethereum, and the Ethereum network is reaching consensus about the event. And I said, but hang on, the event occurred between the doctor and the patient. There's no mystery about the keys. These people have got keys. It's proper key management. The doctor and the patient are in the same room. They know each other. They're using definite keys. Why do you need consensus about that? And you know what? The engineer said, well, because the patient has given consent to have their record on the blockchain.
Oh, got it.
And I had this horrible sinking feeling that these people were confusing the words consent and consensus.
Right.
And I'm not kidding. There was that level of confusion about what the promise of the blockchain is versus the promise that occurs between a doctor and the patient. And in that particular scenario, I can't imagine, for the life of me, I can't imagine what value is added by having 1,000 computers all voting and reaching consensus about the fact that the doctor said yes to the patient. Like, what is going on there that requires a blockchain? What is required is that the doctor and the patient probably both have a smart card, or they've both got keys and secure elements in their mobile phones, and they look at each other across the desk and they agree that this event is going to go into a database, and that event is digitally signed and time-stamped, at the point of the medical service.
Yeah.
It's kind of it's not the sort of scenario that to me speaks of consensus and distribution and a whole bunch of computers trying to work out what's going on.
Right, yeah.
There's no uncertainty about it.
Was that a startup?
It was not a startup, and I'm not going to say who it was,
Okay.
but I think it's going to turn out to be one of the 80%. That it's a proof of concept that turns out to be maybe it delivers some learning, and these are smart people doing the work. I just hope that they come through it after a few months of work and realize what's going on.
Yeah. Well, I think, and we spoke about this in the past as well, there's this whole blockchain phenomenon happening. And I think it captures a lot of people's imagination. I mean, definitely started a few years ago where it just kind of, even though you said some people don't know about it, and I think most people don't know much about blockchains that they even exist, but there is a community there that's where so much energy is concentrating on doing something with blockchains that changes the world. Why do you think that this technology, still now 10 years after this white paper, is capturing people's imagination in the way it does?
Look, I think the white paper was very sexy. It came at a really crucial point in the tech cycle as well as the economic cycle with the financial crisis. Coming up to 10 years, it'll be 10 years in November, I think, since the Bitcoin white paper was published. it's very romantic. It's very sexy. You know, Nakamoto is a tragic figure. Still, nobody knows who it was. There's a good idea that Nakamoto might actually be dead, and so you know, there's some tragedy and some romance attached to that.
Mm-hmm.
But and there's also there's a whole wave of people, and you know, you may have heard this yourself. I've heard it multiple times. I've heard entrepreneurs, 50-year-old entrepreneurs, say to me, I missed the internet wave. I'm not missing blockchain. Now, that's still a crapshoot. It's a gambling kind of philosophy that says that I'm going to catch this wave now. I'm not going to miss out again.
Interesting point. I mean, what I've heard just a few days ago is internet entrepreneurs who were quite successful saying .com was interesting, but blockchain technology is even more interesting and 10 times faster.
Yeah, look, certainly faster. We've seen an amazing amount of activity occur in a matter of months, whereas you know, the internet took a couple of decades to build. That does not speak of success, though. I mean, that is not the rapid dumping of billions of dollars of so-called investment into this is not a predictor of success. Mm-hmm. You know, people had FOMO. You know, we think that our 13-year-old kids have FOMO because they have to go to bed and they're not allowed to keep cruising, you know, Facebook. But there's nothing like the FOMO of a 50-year-old entrepreneur or a whole bunch of, you know, standard bricks and mortar companies who have been told that the future of retail or the future of supply chain is the blockchain and you better get onto it. Wow. You know, the FOMO is astonishing, and it's still quite difficult to be exactly clear about why that's the case. You know, I've been in technology for 30 years, and I have been told repeatedly that I need to speak business. I need to not talk about encryption and key lengths and technology, but we need to talk about business outcomes, and that's absolutely correct. But I look at the blockchain phenomenon, and you know, I'm astonished that people can get so far and spend so much money based on something that's really not properly explained. I've never seen anything like it. You know, there is a real lack of critical thinking, and there is this desperation to believe. Now, I think the belief is really important. Blockchain solved this unsolvable problem. It's very much like the Wright brothers' fire. You see something with your own eyes that you've been told is impossible. What happened for 10 years after the Wright brothers' fire was that everyone and their dog ran off to their garages and their sheds, and they started building their own aeroplanes. They copied the Wright brothers' flyer, and if you have a look at the first generation of aeroplanes through 1904 to about 1914, again, 80% of them were just farcical, and most of them crashed. So the parallel is really strong. It takes about 10 years to really do some proper engineering, and we're seeing that. You know, we've traversed the examples of third generation ledgers that are doing quite well. It's still early days.
But you know, it's also interesting because I mean, that whole theme of flying. I mean, that was the theme of my blockchain film, and I think it's a good analogy that you made and other people I spoke to as well, where they said it is really like airplanes, that, you know, the Wright brothers came up with something that nobody thought is possible. In the Bitcoin white paper, Satoshi Nakamoto came up with a solution that many people thought was impossible. And then they wanted to get involved in it. It created an energy where they thought, I also want to be part of this very special thing that is happening here. But of course, nobody knew with the airplane that it would end up where we are today, right? Where it's totally normal to board a plane and fly across the globe. And, you know, there's hundreds of thousands of people in the air at any second during the day.
Yeah.
But still, right? I mean, the dream of flying for people, that's obviously impossible to conceive for maybe thousands of years. And all of a sudden it seemed possible. And I feel here there's something very similar. And so I believe you're right. It can be fear of missing out. But still, there is something deeper there. It's not just a business interest, I feel. There's something else too.
Yeah, the deep thing is probably the freedom of decentralization. And, amongst computer scientists and amongst the early internet libertarians, there was a realization that people could, for the first time, exercise a great deal of freedom in cyberspace. They were free to adopt their own personas. They were free to connect in ways that were frictionless and not mediated by parents or teachers or now banks. It appears with Bitcoin, you can decouple yourself from the banks and the financial system, and there's a whole lot of freedom in that. Now, the sad thing is that the freedom of Bitcoin is very qualified. The freedom of Bitcoin is that you can move Bitcoin between Alice and Bob without an intermediary. And it appears that Bitcoin created decentralization. So, decentralization has been a holy cow of computer science for a long time, or distributed networks, truly distributed networks. But I think that we need to remember that Nakamoto started with decentralization as a design point.
He didn't invent it.
And said,
it was there already.
It was a starting assumption that we wanted to find a way of doing cryptocurrency without an intermediary. Now, if you gave Nakamoto the design problem of saying, let's do digital cash with an intermediary, they would have come up with something quite radically different. Let's assume that Nakamoto was a genius architect. They would have come up with something that was quite different and a hell of a lot more efficient than proof of work. So you need to remember that the blockchain network, the Bitcoin and the public blockchain networks don't just deliver decentralization in any general sense. They only decentralize the supervision of cryptocurrency. Comes back to this off-chain thing. If you think that you can now do decentralized electronic health records, I'm not even sure why you'd want to do that. You're not going to decentralize a doctor. I don't want to crowdsource medicine. I want to go to a board-certified surgeon when I'm going to have an operation. But if in some sense you think that you're going to decentralize medicine or disintermediate the power structure of medicine, the Bitcoin network is not going to do it for you because it does not cope with that analog to digital off-chain presence.
Yes, I get the point with decentralization. That is probably one of the things that inspires people.
People are yearning for that freedom, and the freedom of flight, and the freedom of decentralized computing. Decentralized computing on these blockchains is really a qualified property, and it's just not quite what people imagine and hope it to be.
It's interesting though, decentralization as a main motivator, and then people at banks try to work on on this topic, on the bank's money and time.
Nakamoto must roll in their grave at the idea that stock exchanges and big settlement banks are now running blockchain type of algorithms. But that's the story of the evolution of tech. R3 noted that the idea of being able to share some banking information amongst competing banks, not a lot of information, but to compare and share some information. And, Richard Brown from R3 put it really nicely a couple of years ago, said, you've got 5 banks sharing some data, and they all know that that I know that we all see the same thing. And that there's that radical transparency in some of these distributed ledgers that means that a lot of information, when it gets onto the ledger, is already like pre-audited. You don't need to reconcile this stuff because the process of getting data, or the process of creating the ledger entries, means that everybody knows that the data is agreed to. And that's a pretty powerful thing. That means that you can settle things a lot faster. You don't need a T+1 day. You don't need a whole day of reconciling databases. Because the algorithm itself pre-reconciles the data before it gets on the ledger. So that's kind of a very qualified form of decentralization. And again, it's quite different from what the libertarian Nakamoto or the anarchist Nakamoto thought that the algorithm was going to deliver. So, I really hope that Nakamoto wherever they are has a sense of humour, and says what the baby is turned into.
Yeah, it's a good point. I mean, speaking of sense of humor, do you often get attacked from people in the crypto and blockchain space when you criticize their projects or approaches?
Oh, look, yeah, for sure. And I can be a bit provocative, and I think I can be a bit strident. But some of the people out there deserve stridency. There are some people out there that say the most preposterous things about this technology is going to change democracy. This technology is going to change voting. Voting on a blockchain is a bad idea, and it's not just me. Nobody, no less a figure than Ron Rivest says that blockchain is a bad idea for voting. And in my words, voting, democratic voting, one person, one vote. You need to have one person, one key, one vote. And there's no blockchain out there that is even concerned with the key management problem of one person, one key, one vote. It's not what blockchain does. And so I am strident about that. And some people take umbrage at their sacred blockchain being dismissed. And some things you can dismiss out of hand. But it's like any technology wave. There are some really good people out there that are working hard, and I've got enormous respect for an enormous number of people that are working on this. And I think that we all get along quite fine. But I'm just one voice, and if that voice upsets some people, then that's so be it. That's certainly what's been happening in the last couple of years.
Well, it's also part of an evolution, I think, right? I mean, not everybody can agree, and if we don't all agree, then hopefully something good comes out of it. I'm wondering, how did you originally get into science?
Into science? Wow, I was a geeky kid. I was playing with chemistry sets and playing with maths and playing with sort of Pascal's triangle and stuff when I was a kid. I've always loved that. I've always loved practical computing too. I did a lot of, learned a lot of languages in college. But the stuff I really liked was embedded systems and programming. I cut my teeth writing code for the world's first implantable defibrillators in the 1990s.
Oh, cool.
And that was fantastic. Microcontroller, 8 bits. Measuring cardiac signals and generating pacing pulses and generating defibrillator waveforms and writing the operating system software for these implantable devices and playing with breadboards, and so the software actually made things happen. And that was fantastic. My journey in identity and my journey in cyberspace and cybersecurity is really has really been about the practical application of cryptography. I fell into digital identity quite accidentally in 1995. I had been working at that defibrillator company I spoke about, working in the US, and it was a forced move. The company was in trouble. My family wanted to return to Australia, and I found a job working for a little startup company doing PKI, public key infrastructure. And I remembered a little bit of cryptography from my undergraduate maths, but became fascinated by public key and what a lot of people now call zero knowledge proofs. So public key is a way of doing things with your private key that is easily verifiable by anybody out in the public. Now, the original PKI ideas were that it would be pretty cool to have a digital certificate that encapsulated everything that you needed to know about somebody, and wouldn't it be great if you had a certificate that proved that you weren't a dog and that proved that you had a particular bank account and you lived in Australia and everything you possibly needed to know was in that certificate. And I worked for a couple of companies that had that vision, and it dawned on me very early on that it was more about attributes. It was more about what than who. Like, it's not who you are that matters in business. It's what you are that matters. What is your credit card number? In fact, I've got 5 different credit card numbers, right? So how do you know that any of them are true? I've got 5 different credit personas. But how do you know that it's really a patient? How do you know it's really a doctor? Some people are patients and doctors at the same time, but when a doctor goes to hospital and becomes a patient, you do not want to know that it's a doctor. In fact, hospitals go to a lot of pain and a lot of process to treat a doctor as a patient and not to treat a doctor as a doctor. So, as soon as you get into digital identity management, it becomes painfully obvious early on that you need to set aside the personal and you need to zone in on, paradoxically, these sort of impersonal attributes. And I found really early on that public key certificates were actually much better at proving the what than the who. And so, I've been on this sort of 20-year plus journey of trying to leverage public key certificates and leverage these zero-knowledge proofs to establish claims and attributes. I guess because I've been doing that for some time, that when blockchain identity came along 3 or 4 years ago, it just didn't really make sense. It takes a lot of discipline to separate the personal from the attributes, and not many of those identity startups, blockchain identity startups, really had that discipline. They were sort of wading in boots and all, trying to solve the trust problem. It's a strange category error that people make with blockchain. The Economist magazine called it the trust machine with that cover article 3 or 4 years ago, and you still see people very carelessly, very loosely equating blockchain with trust. And this is not a matter of semantics or philosophy. You got to remember that the blockchain was for moving money between people who didn't trust each other, didn't want to trust each other, didn't even question whether or not they were trustworthy. They just want to move those Bitcoin. And blockchain is insanely good at doing that. It doesn't deliver trust. It delivers an amazing outcome with zero trust. And the idea that world, that bit of algorithm would deliver trust as well is a really serious category error. I like the old Italian. I think it's Italian. There's an old proverb that says, it's nice to trust, but it's better not to. And it's kind of Machiavellian, and it goes back to Renaissance thinking about how do you do business with people, and how do you decouple trust? Like, how do you make things happen in a civilized society without having to question each other all the time? And I think that the less said about the trust, the better. I've got to a point in my career where I really, really deliberately want to stop using the word identity, and I think that we've really got to do the same thing with trust. And a lot of a huge amount of society is around dealing with people without trusting them, and I think that's really important. And I think, again, maybe that thinking is a bit clinical, and it depersonalizes things, and it leaves people with a bit of a gap, and that they are yearning for something that sort of repersonalizes the internet and puts a bit of magic back into it, like breathes a bit of fire back into the internet. And I think that you can explain a lot of the blockchain excitement around that yearning to breathe some fire back into the network. And blockchain certainly does that at a metaphorical level.
Let's take a quick break for a message from our sponsors. Descartes Finance takes tradition into the future, harnessing a combination of cutting-edge technology and personal advice in the service of your personal interests. Descartes cuts through the financial noise and focuses exclusively on scientific and evidence-based investing to give investors a better understanding of how to view the financial markets and provide them with the respective investment strategies. To learn more, please visit www.descartes-finance.com. That's DESCARTES-finance.com.
That yearning to breathe some fire back into the network, and blockchain certainly does that at a metaphorical level.
Yeah, I guess. I mean, that's definitely something I heard from people where they said blockchain technology, cryptocurrencies are a new kind of internet, and they enable the original vision of the internet that people had. And can somehow swing back this network that we have now that's full of advertising and data problems into something that's controlled by the people. I think that's really a fascination.
And I am 110% behind that. It reminds me of the self-sovereign identity movement, which is a real calling for a repowering of the internet or a rebalancing. There's been the vendor relationship management movement, VRM, which is the inverse of customer relationship management. And it's powered by a real resentment of the digital divide, the power that digital companies have got, the way that established businesses have leveraged networking to just maintain their disadvantage that they have over us. And look, I get that. A lot of what happens in social media and digital companies and the advertising-fueled internet, it just sucks. And we've got to do something about it. But you don't actually have a lot of success rebalancing the internet by reclaiming identity because it's not identity that matters. Identity is like the lightning rod. And it certainly appears as though Google and Facebook and Twitter, they identify us and then they take advantage of us. But that identity is just a handle. It's just a convenience. If it was possible to have self-sovereign identity, and if it was possible for Steve Wilson to say to the world, I am Steve, and I will tell you who I am, and I will define my identity. If that was possible, you would still have Facebook with its cookies and its multiple signals still working out where I shop and what I like to drink and who I hang with, and they would still be profiling me and making a ridiculous amount of money from big data. So I think you've got to define the problem and frame the problem. The problem with the internet and with the surveillance capitalism is that people are making unreasonable amounts of money behind our backs by surveilling and monitoring what we do. And I've got one word to say to you: GDPR. The European style of privacy power that is sweeping the world now is just the beginning, I think, of a new order in the digital economy. I think that we are seeing, and GDPR is not all that new. It's really a hardening and a refinement of privacy laws that have been around in Europe for 40 years. And, we've had them in Australia for 30 years, and over 100 countries around the world for at least 10 years have had privacy laws. GDPR is getting a lot of attention because of the fines, but really it's the logical progression of data protection laws that try and put limits on how people exploit data in exactly the same way that we had new laws in the 1800s that controlled the way that crude oil was dug up and refined and shipped around the place. So when we have these massive new revolution around data, at the moment it's still Wild West. Like, if data is this superb raw material that will fuel the new economy, then you just can't have social media companies doing what they like with this stuff and making billion-dollar fortunes. You need to have some sort of rebalance. So what I'm saying is that the yearning for a fairer internet is very reasonable and is long overdue, and it's coming anyway through GDPR, and it's coming through the Americans will have their homegrown approach to privacy. They'll do it their own way. It will just mean that the people in the street, the individual, is going to get a better deal out of this new economy. And I think that we're going to achieve this without self-sovereign identity and certainly without blockchain. I think that blockchain will be an important niche in this. It'll be another sort of database technology that's going to be very important in some transactions. But I still remain unconvinced that blockchain is the type of thing that can revolutionize the internet.
Good point. Yeah, no, I think
so. It's funny that we're landing on the same place, and I've got very good friends that are trying to achieve these outcomes. But I think that we're going to get there in a more complicated way, and I think we're going to get there through governance and regulation more than we are through any particular technology.
Right. See, for me, this is really about exploring new areas where people push technology to the forefront and hope they can really make an impact with it. And they may achieve that or they may not. And some may fall, flat on their faces and lose their investors' money. But others may push the envelope a little bit.
I should say that I understand the cryptocurrency philosophy. I understand the need that some people feel for anonymous or unregulated peer-to-peer money, and it's just not my world. I'm sympathetic to it, and I think I understand it, and I hope it happens. My first exposure to the Bitcoin white paper probably came in about 2012, thereabouts. It crossed my desk, bitcoin.pdf, and I read it and found it absolutely amazing. And what Nakamoto did was very surprising to me because, I'd worked around DigiCash in 1995. So I had an idea how hard the problem was, and I thought, wow, this is fantastic. But then I set it aside because cryptocurrency to me is just not my world. I don't need it myself. I don't think it's going to change the world. I think that we're going to have fiat currency as the dominant thing forever. But when I took real attention to Bitcoin and blockchain was when people started doing blockchain identity. And I think I've told this story before. I was at the 2015 Cloud Identity Summit in a crowd of about 700 people, the creme de la creme of identity professionals. And the keynote speaker mentioned blockchain as something to keep an eye on and said, by the way, who's doing anything with blockchain? And I counted about 6 hands went up in an auditorium of 700 people. And that's when I thought, wow, this is interesting. I knew that there were 30 different blockchain identity startups, but the identity community itself was not embracing blockchain. So, as an analyst, I thought that indicated that there was a really interesting sort of disruption occurring and that I should get onto that. So now you've had that bifurcation now where cryptocurrency is a big thing and there's hundreds of the things around there, and there is this idea that there will be a community money forever. It's got to be said, though, that, the vast majority of cryptocurrency that's out there now is speculative and it's not really for currency.
Absolutely.
It's to make money. And it's kind of, again, I think that Nakamoto would probably roll in their grave. I think that it's abhorrent to the original intention of having a peer-to-peer community-based non-fiat currency. Meanwhile, of course, to really rub salt into the wounds, the properties of having very low-friction cryptocurrency and a hybrid fiat cryptocurrency kind of model, which people are exploring in places like Singapore, that again is going to create some allergic reactions amongst the libertarians. But let's be clear about what problems we're trying to solve. If there is going to be pure digital money instead of this silly paper stuff that we've got, and if it's going to be not controlled by credit card companies, then it's pretty predictable that the fiat currencies and the central reserve banks are going to see what this technology can do for them, and why not? I don't think the cryptocurrency people can object to that. They've sort of let the genie out of the bottle, and the possibility of doing things that are less administered is now out there in the public domain. So, I don't think you can really be surprised by the fact that central banks are trying to get into that.
Absolutely. I think that's what many of the proponents wanted for the longest time, that the banks are getting into it and take it seriously. Only now what happened is that they came up with their own version of it.
Yeah, exactly.
Steve, what's your view on smart contracts?
Oh, wow. I think we're back to the beginning again. If the original blockchain just didn't do what people thought it did, then I've got the same view about smart contracts, I'm afraid. It seems to me, now I'm not a lawyer, but I've been around lawyers long enough to know that the essence of a contract is that two people are going to get together and they want something to happen. They're going to agree on the terms of a contract. There's going to be an offer, there's going to be consideration, and there's going to be some sort of settlement where they can agree that something happened and they walk away happy. The idea of a smart contract appears to be that most of the important things there can be codified or mechanized and put onto a blockchain. Now, depending on who you talk to, sort of magic happens. Some of the claims for smart contracts are really, let's call it, it's frankly preposterous. The idea that you codify everything and stick that on a ledger, and then the idea that code is law. Some people say that these smart contracts will not just make legal processes more efficient, so let's come back to that, but some people say that it will eliminate legal processes. It will eliminate court cases. You will not go to court anymore because the blockchain is perfect, and the smart contract will be unassailable. And there's so many problems with that. I mean, to begin with, smart contracts are code, and code is buggy. And if people agree to use a piece of code, but the code is buggy and therefore it doesn't do what you agreed it would do, then whatever that thing is, it becomes kind of invalid. It's the most so the code is law mantra, I think, is just self-evidently ridiculous.
Who said that? Whose words were those?
The code is law. I mean, it's a hashtag on Twitter. There's a lot of people take it seriously. And I have argued with people at big consulting firms who've adopted this idea that the smart contract will stand no matter what, and you won't go to court. Well, I'm afraid that you do go to court in matters of contract law, because if the contract isn't what you thought it was, something's happened, in blockchain parlance, something has happened off-chain.
Yeah.
The most amazing, the most interesting thing to me about a smart contract is, how did the people agree to use this smart contract technology in the first place? So you and I might say we're going to execute some sort of property transaction using a smart contract, and you and I are going to agree that something happening in Ethereum will represent my car, and you'll take delivery of the car, and when you're happy with it, you'll get paid in Ether. The really interesting thing to me was that you and I agreed to use the smart contract somewhere in meat space, off-chain. We thought that this would be a cool thing to do. Now, we did that based on an understanding of what the smart contract is, and that understanding can't be in the smart contract. It has to be off-chain, or it has to be outside the contract. And so there's a confusion of levels. I don't think a smart contract is going to be anything other than a clever script, like a piece of embedded software that makes things happen. Now, if it's done in a decentralized distributed computing environment, and maybe there's an agreement between multiple parties where elements of that agreement occur around the world, like in shipping or something like that, then that becomes really interesting, that if you need different things to happen in a coordinated way at different points in the planet, and everybody agrees that that's going to somehow be in synchrony, then I think this smart contract technology might be useful. But we've got to demystify it. We've got to get away from this code as law mantra, and we've got to realise that the really interesting thing about any contract occurs off-chain, and that I think that's in itself, that realisation will help people temper their expectations of the magic of a smart contract.
Yeah, right. I mean, often I read and hear also from speaking with people that they say, well, there's no need for smart contracts, just for normal agreements that you and I would do if we just, if we buy or sell a car, then that's not necessary. But what if there are autonomous vehicles, negotiating rights of way or things like these? Then that may make more sense. The shipping example you said, I mean, they also see it.
Yeah, certainly. And some of the best financially strongest use cases for distributed ledgers are coming out of shipping, where if you can help construct a shipping manifest in a way that the information in the manifest is sort of pre-audited or pre-reconciled, and the state of the cargo is known and agreed to, and then it turns out that something is missing in the cargo. Famously, the avocados never made it onto the ship because there was a flat tire in the lorry on the way to the port, and somebody's disappointed. They look at what's arrived at the destination. They're missing something. They're disappointed. They get into a dispute. The most sort of prosaic business case that I've seen so far is that, and this comes from IBM, that a complicated shipping dispute could be resolved in 5 days instead of 60 days. And if you can really streamline dispute resolution, because people will agree on the state of the data and they'll be able to rewind or unwind what's on the ship or unwind what's in a supply chain. If you can do that quicker, then time is money. And there's some very prosaic efficiency calculations that are done that says that there's billions of dollars of cost just simply in the delay that occurs in these complicated transactions. So, and that's great. Whether or not the idea of a smart contract comes along and adds a lot of magic to it, I'm just not convinced. The term smart contract has adopted sort of a life of its own, and smart contracts are intrinsic to the Ethereum platform in ways that aren't actually terribly clear. If you take a bit of embedded software, and I explained before that I cut my teeth in defibrillator software, there's nothing smarter, I guess, than an algorithm that sits inside your chest for 5 years and waits for you to have a heart attack and directs a 600-volt shock to save your life. That's an autonomous, incredibly complicated piece of software. We wrote 40,000 lines of software with 3 bugs in the entire system. And that's kind of smart, but we didn't run around giving it any magical properties. It was just well-designed, real-time software that looked out for signals and responded to them in an autonomous way. There's no magic there. I think that a lot of the idea that smart contract is somehow more powerful than just a piece of automatic software that is responding to the environment and making things happen. Maybe, forgive my cynicism, but as a real-time systems engineer from the past, I don't see that the smart contract is doing anything that we haven't been doing for a long time already. Except, I do accept that having the same smart contract running in a number of different nodes around the world in synchrony, and if people agree that they agree that it's going to do something for their collective benefit, then I think that there's some goodness in that. But again, let's just be quite qualified about what we expect this thing to do.
Do you think it's maybe just a glorified script, a smart contract?
Yeah, I would put it that way. I think it is a glorified script.
What you said, you mentioned the shipping example before. Is that an application though where smart contract would make sense, or do you think do you see other applications too?
I think that's the classic supply chain and shipping, where you've got a lot of complicated inputs occurring to a shared ledger, and that ledger is important at a number of different points around the supply chain and around the world, and you want to reach agreement really quickly about the state of that data, then yes. I just don't know that calling it smart contract helps. I really balk at the word contract, because I think that all of those shipping companies and freight forwarders and import-export agents are all going to have to agree off-chain that this technology is going to suit their purposes, and they're going to pay their money, and they're going to install the code, and they're going to press buttons, and stuff will happen. And, like you say, it's a script, and the computer software will make things happen, and the computer software might direct a payment. If the ship gets unloaded and everybody's happy, then direct payment instructions all around the world. Well, I don't even know why those payment instructions would be cryptocurrency. I don't think it would necessarily be Ether. I think it would be standard bank transfers. So absolutely there's some goodness there, and having a new scripting language that makes sure that all of these distributed nodes are in synchrony and they're all behaving the same way, then that's great. And that is goodness. But I don't call it a contract, because, the actual contract is formed off-chain.
Yeah, I see that point. Do you think that platform for that script or for that piece of code exists already, or is there still work to be done to create a good one?
Look, I think that some computer science is required, and I think the work that Buterin has done in the Ethereum platform probably has helped. Now, I'm not a distributed computing expert, and I do know some experts that find all of this mildly irritating because there were ways in the 1980s of making sure that distributed computers were all doing the same thing. So distributed computing as a field is not new. I think the Ethereum platform has created some new efficiencies and some new ways of, making this accessible more quickly. Some of the things that bother me, though, about Ethereum is that I don't know why you necessarily had to come up with a new language to make this happen. So the Solidity language is a little problematic. It's brand new. There are bugs in the language. There's certainly bugs in the smart contract. And it's a strange added level of complexity that if you're going to come up with a platform to do, let's say, distributed scripting and decentralized scripting, then why you'd go and throw a new language at that at the same time? I've sometimes said that I think that Buterin was trying to do 2 or 3 PhDs all at once. He was trying to...
Yeah, I heard you say that, yes.
Yeah, take the Bitcoin blockchain and do it better and come up with smart contracts and invent a new programming language. All of this stuff is... forgive me for being a bit conservative, but I'm a security guy, and you need to take baby steps and you need to be really careful, especially in cryptography. It takes 20 years for a new cryptography algorithm to be bedded in and accepted by the community, and you actually don't want things to happen much more quickly than that. In security, you've got to be careful what you ask for in case you get it. And the idea of frictionless cryptographic development and new languages and new scripts that are themselves buggy. Some auditors have come back and said that they're finding much more than one bug per 100 lines of software when they look at smart contracts. You make haste at your own peril in security, and
that's maybe one thing, right? When I asked before what the crypto and blockchain space needs to get to the next level, maybe it's slowing down a little bit.
Oh, definitely. You got to be careful what you ask for in security, and all of this lack of friction and haste, I think, is really perilous. I think you can certainly lay a lot of blame for the strife that we're in at things, frankly, at the Agile movement and the MVP movement. I know that in the right hands, Agile is a good thing, and I know that we need more artful, real-world development methodologies. I know all that, but I also see time and time again the Agile movement and the MVP movement being used to cut corners. You can't go around saying to people, design security in, at the same time as calling for minimum viable products. It just licenses people to cut corners, and by the time you release an MVP and start making money off of it, there's just no incentive left for people to go back in and do a lot of non-productive work hardening the security of these things. So
yeah, that's a real problem, isn't it?
I've blogged about this. It's not a popular view, but time and time again, you can clearly see that really serious bugs out there have occurred because people are writing code too quickly. I had when I was running pacemaker software at this American company in the 1990s, I had a team of 30 people designing software that, it had to be pretty cool. It had to be pretty robust for pacemaker software. And one of the innovations that we had in our methodology was that we actually asked people to turn their computers off for one day a week and to design with pencil and paper and to get around whiteboards and to explain each other's software in English using pen and paper. And it's a discipline that I think is lacking now. People tend to think with their fingers and think with their keyboards, and we're losing the ability to think critically, and we're just rushing. And I think this haste is something that is not always helpful. So, sure, in all things in moderation, but if we were to slow down a little bit and try and think more clearly about what we're doing, and to remind ourselves what the blockchain was originally for, I think that would help. Yes, I do.
Do you think this haste and this, some other people would call it speed, do you think that comes because there's so much money to be made in this space?
Oh, without a doubt, the FOMO is about getting in quick, and some of it's just sort of crazy. The Dogecoin that was created by a young guy who just wanted to see that it could be done, and now he's on paper, or whatever you call it these days, on cyber, he's a billionaire off of Dogecoin. There's not a lot of rationality behind that, and I've seen the guy himself laugh about it, but he laughs very awkwardly because he's in a pretty good position, and why not? What to say? We live in such strange terms, and I just hope that, you need a sense of humour about this, but you also need to back your own critical thinking and look at that and say, that's absurd, it's unsustainable. A lot of this is going to fall into a stinking heap pretty quickly, and we're going to return to some sort of normality.
Have you seen that happen a little bit, maybe? I mean, more and more people are getting critical, and when I made these interviews for the blockchain film, it was hard to find people who had a qualified criticism. There were a lot of ranting critics of everything, including the central bank and paper money and the state and the governments. And that is just not qualified criticism of blockchain technology.
There is some sanity. I used to feel quite alone 18 months ago, but there's a lot of people that have been quite harsh now about blockchain. There is a lot of just outright cynicism now that says, this is no more than a database. Now, I actually find myself not that extreme. I absolutely acknowledge that blockchain is not a database. It's more clever than that, but it's much more specialized than any database you've ever seen. But, I was at the RSA conference last month, and the famous cryptographers panel, and it's not just famous because of the cryptographers, but the panel itself is famous. It's been a centerpiece of RSA now for 20 years. And you get the absolute gods of this field. Who did we have this year? Ron Rivest, Adi Shamir, Whit Diffie, Moxie Marlinspike, brilliant people. And across the board, there was a very sober assessment that blockchain really wasn't something terribly special. And in particular, there are some things that you just don't want to do on a blockchain. You don't want to put health records on a blockchain. You don't want to vote on a blockchain. Not yet. Now, I think the cryptographers need to be listened to because they're sober. They absolutely know what they're talking about. But they've also got experience of patience, and they know that it takes 10 or 20 years. You had Ron Rivest on the panel. In particular, this is a diversion. They were talking about quantum cryptography or post-quantum and quantum-safe algorithms. And now it could take 20 years to come up with a quantum-safe algorithm, but Ron Rivest himself pointed out that it took 10 or 15 years for the RSA algorithm to take off. So these things take time. And I think that you take that experience and it tells you that it's very unlikely that something like blockchain could take off in a couple of years and change the world. The world doesn't change at that rate, especially when it comes to cryptography and IT. So we tend to think that cyberspace happens quickly, and we tend to think that you can write code quickly and create businesses. And, my God, Facebook is only 10 years old. So some things do happen quickly, but you're seeing that in another 10 years of Facebook might look really different, and it might just look like noise. It might look like these fabulous businesses come and go ever so quickly, but meanwhile the actual rate of change of security is a bit slower and a bit more circumspect, and maybe the ability for some crypto magic to fundamentally change the internet. Maybe that's wishful thinking.
Is it, or maybe?
I'm reserving judgment. We talked about this before. I think that blockchain will lead to things that are very important. But even so, distributed ledger technologies that transform shipping and transform the supply chain, these are quite prosaic things. And you might, in another 10 years' time, you might still not see the internet looking radically different. And I don't think we need, I don't think we need to radically change computing to fix some of the horrible problems we've got. We've got digital companies that are taking advantage of us. They're shafting us. They're using our own data behind our backs. There's a horrible exploitation. It's not right that the richest people in the world have made their billions purely out of data. It's just not right. But I don't see blockchain and I don't see self-sovereign identity changing that. I see GDPR and I see data protection laws around the world, even in the US, producing a new order and sort of righting the ship and producing a fairer playing field. And I don't think that this is going to be a technological revolution. I think it's going to be a regulatory revolution, which is not as sexy as blockchain, and it's not as sexy as sort of a new sort of libertarian computing decentralized network. But the lesson is that society really changes. I think the lesson is that society changes through regulation. We saw it after the oil rush. We saw it after the first industrial revolution. Steam power came along and sweatshops came along and child slavery and, children living in coal mines came along. But the pendulum swung back to a fair playing field, not through any new technology, but through governance and social movements and people voting for what was reasonable. So it's not sexy, but I think the truth is that the IT revolution is going to get corrected and is going to be moderated and mollified by social change and social institutions and new laws. I think that we're going to get an enormous wave of legal innovation in the next few years when the importance of data becomes so clear. Data is a really weird stuff. It's intangible. It's difficult to regulate, but I know that there are libertarians out there that say you're never going to regulate data. Well, I'm sorry. We regulate intangibles like intellectual property, and we even regulate electromagnetic spectrum. There's nothing more intangible than spectrum, and it's tightly regulated. And we buy and sell the stuff, and fortunes are made off spectrum. So I'm not anti-capitalist. I'm not anti entrepreneurship. I think that people should be making a lot of money out of data, as long as that bargain is fairer, and as long as people making money aren't exploiting others. So I do think that the next 10 or 15 years will be really interesting. I think that the let's call it the reaction to the internet is still forming, and the reaction to the data economy is still forming. And I think it's going to be, the action is going to be regulatory more than technological.
And maybe also that reaction is forming with or without blockchain technology.
Oh, without. The GDPR has got nothing to do with blockchain. Again, I use the GDPR as a sign of things to come. It's a sign of a new order, a new making the digital economy orderly, and that's been a long time coming. I think the guts of self-sovereign identity has been a long time coming. I just think that the idea that better civil rights online will come from reshaping identity. I think that's just idealistic. I don't think it's going to play out that way. I think that the asymmetries that we have and the power imbalances that we have in the digital economy will get rectified, not through reimagining identity, but just through saying there should be controls on the way that personal information flows. There should be controls on the way that people monetize personal information. These are not new ideas. We've had data protection laws for decades, and they're just becoming more important now because of the transgressions of Facebook and the transgressions, indeed, of surveillance society. People have had enough. They've had a gutful, and
yeah. Well, we spoke about that in Silicon Valley last year. I mean, when you said most people have no idea what happens with their data, and I think it's true. It's absolutely true.
Do you know there's a very interesting case, and it comes back to Facebook. Yet again, a Facebook example. But Facebook has got this weird and wonderful feature called People You May Know, and every now and again, the People You May Know facility throws up some absolute shockers. So, about 5 or 6 years ago, a bigamist with 2 wives was outed on Facebook because the 2 wives got friend requests saying, you probably know Alice because she's a friend of Bob. And Carol got this thing, and then Alice got something saying, you probably know Carol because she's a friend of Bob. Well, it turned out that Alice and Carol were both married to the same guy. And the Facebook algorithm discovered this. Now, I wrote about it at the time. I felt that it was only a matter of time before this algorithm started introducing patients to each other, mental health patients and psychiatrist patients, and indeed that's what happened. Now, most recently, a sex worker in the United States who apparently led a very respectable double life, sex worker and a normal business person of some sort, ran a very careful, normal, mainstream life, and she was a very smart, digitally literate person who for years had maintained this sort of second persona, nothing illegal about it. It was at pains to keep her different walks of life separate on Facebook. Well, she got outed on Facebook despite her best efforts. Friends of hers started getting People You May Know suggestions that were revealing her secret life. Now, I'm telling this story because it was broken by Kashmir Hill, a famous IT journalist, and probably one of the sharpest people in all matters cyber that you could possibly come across. And Cash Hill looked at this case, looked at it hard for months and months, and she could not work out where the signals were that the People You May Know algorithm absorbed to work out this sex worker's double life. Now, the story is really important because the very finest investigative journalists in the world can't figure it out. And yet, the Facebooks of the world tell us that, the world is full of these digitally sophisticated digerati who are very happy with the way that Facebook works, and they're very happy with the ad-driven economy, and we're supposedly very happy with the bargain that we have, free services, free Facebook in return for data. And Mark Zuckerberg will tell you that people are happy with that. It's manifestly untrue. People have got no idea what's happening with data. The very best tech journalists in the world can't figure out how Facebook works. And so I think that there's I'm going to call it as a lie. There's a really deep, dark lie in social media that overestimates the sophistication of the people. Now, we've seen this before. We've seen it in big tobacco when, the big tobacco slogan was that people know that smoking is bad for you. They make smoking a free choice. And that idea that people smoke happily was the rationale for big tobacco people saying we're not responsible for cancer. Well, I'm not trying to make social media as bad as cancer. I'm not making that point, but I am saying that social media companies know that people are not as smart as they think they are. Mm-hmm. And I think that there's an exploitation of that ignorance. I think that people are ignorant of how Facebook manages personal information. And if you are running a business that takes advantage of people's ignorance, then I think that that's really wrong. And I think under consumer protection law, it's more than wrong. Mm-hmm. And that could be another really interesting legal battle in the next 10 years, will be to work out whether or not people are being taken advantage of. And I'm positive that they are.
But I think what you said there, your Facebook example, is perfect because that opens the discussion for all these people rushing in and saying, yeah, but you can use blockchain technology to switch on certain parts of your digital persona and only these persons can see it and only other persons can see that part. You could maybe monetize part of your data. I mean, what do you think of that promise?
Yeah, there's been some interesting thinking for a long time about actually producing some new economic incentives and some direct payback for people to do a number of things to even up the playing field. and to also produce some better behaviours. At the moment, of course, people's privacy behaviours are famously counterproductive, and we give away a lot of data, and we don't seem to have any inhibition or any friction about that. And I personally think it's because we're still finding our bearings online. I think that, being online is such fun. Let's make no bones about it. Social media, Twitter, Facebook, it's insane fun, and it's important at every level. And we've rushed into that. We just don't have our bearings in cyberspace. Mm-hmm. We don't have any reliable intuitions. And again, I think that Facebook exploits that. So there's been some thinking along the way that if you could produce some economic incentives and it might produce better behaviour, I think that that's important. Another missing analytical frame in all of this is simply change. Another missing analytical frame is change behaviour management. And this is something that public health people know really well. So I mentioned big tobacco before, but certainly public health people know how hard it is to get people to look after their own health. They know it's really hard to get people to give up smoking or even to do easier things like to eat properly and to exercise more,
Yeah, right.
This is really hard. And in security and with social media, people do bad things. They seem to become addicted to Facebook, and they seem to give away too much information, and they seem to pick bad passwords, and they seem to take these ridiculous risks online. Now, I think that we need to understand that through the sort of frame of human nature. And we pick bad passwords, we eat too much, we don't exercise enough, and we drink too much. Humans do stupid things. And my brothers and sisters in security spend a lot of time shaking their heads at how dumb people are with their passwords and how dumb they are with Facebook. But we can't blame the victim. We can't keep blaming people for bad behaviours online because people have bad behaviours in every walk of life. So I think that there's a missing analytical frame there about how to produce better behaviours online.
Well, but then again, this whole argument of the companies should police themselves. I mean,
no,
that's
no. We're going to get market failure. We get market failure in safety all the time. One of the best voices on that issue is actually Bruce Schneier, who's looked, very cleanly and calmly at cybersecurity as a safety matter, and he points out, very reasonably that we don't let auto safety be dictated by market forces. We know from bitter experience that safety will lead to market failures if it's not regulated. So, even the United States accepts quite willingly that some things do need to be subject to enforceable rules and standards. And I think that we'll come to that realisation about cybersecurity. And Bruce Schneier's called for this. Before we get into the Internet of Things, we need to be really especially careful. And indeed, self-driving cars. We need to be really careful about security and whether or not we think that companies can self-regulate for Internet of Things. Software quality in the Internet of Things. We need to have some, just as we do with product safety and, the safety of children's toys and the safety of food. We regulate food ingredients, we regulate restaurants, we regulate public transport, and I think that we're going to have to do the same thing with cybersecurity and privacy for sure.
Yeah. So, I mean, the biggest challenges moving ahead, you think they're not technological, but regulatory, psychological, social?
Well, yeah, let's have a balance of these things. Look, absolutely we have technological challenges. I just say that we're not going to fix these problems with new technology. So the idea that blockchain is going to change society is just, it's utopian. It's really bizarre. It's unbefitting, 50 years of technology experience. We've learned the hard way that, you could say that computers change society. Well, only in a very qualified kind of measured sense. We've learned that, and yet people come along, the utopians come along, they say that blockchain is going to revolutionise democracy. Well, no, it's not. But it is important. It's going to create some really good outcomes. But I think the overall thing that's going to be required to make a better digital economy is going to be more about change management, more about understanding human nature online, making that analog to digital conversion. This is really fascinating to me. There's so much work still got to be done on the analog to digital conversion. And how has the internet changed human nature? Susan Grenfield in the UK says that people's brains are already changing because of the way that they absorb information digitally.
Mm-hmm.
I think that there are some really important, outstanding questions there. I haven't made up my own mind about that one yet, but it seems plausible, and you've got to respect Grenfell. So, has the internet changed? The other funny dynamic is that whenever something really good happens in relation to the internet, then the Arab Spring, and that didn't turn out to be an unqualified success, but the Arab Spring was attributed to Twitter, and the internet was yet again shown to be a revolutionary force for good. But whenever something bad and dark happens on the internet, like the Silk Road or child pornography or terrorism, the defendants of the internet will then fall back in a really kind of placid way and say, the internet's just a communication mechanism, and terrorists communicate on cell phones, and child pornographers always plied their evil trade. So don't blame the internet. And I think there's a really funny double standard. There's a very awkward sort of idealism that goes with the good things that the internet does are because of the internet, and the bad things that the internet does are due to people. And I think that's a real sign of immaturity. I don't think we've quite found our bearings again on, how important is this communication technology? We haven't sorted that out yet. So I would that's going to be super interesting.
Yeah. Well, I think a lot of people are researching that. I'm sure you know this famous Sherry Turkle book.
Yeah, she's great.
Yeah, Alone Together, and I think it's also a little older already, but I think now, years later, people understand and see themselves in these books, right? It's not just game addicts who sit in a gaming parlor for 72 hours in diapers who are addicted to these things. It's many, many normal people too. I mean, have you found yourself make a conscious effort to move more of your life off digital?
From time to time, for sure. And, I love going off grid. I love camping. We're going on a long trek in a couple of months' time that'll be completely off grid. I love it. I certainly try and spend more time with paper books. And
more time again? I mean, where you moved into ebooks and now you're moving back into paper books?
I was never into ebooks personally. I'm an inveterate scribbler. I'll show you the books that I'm reading, and I'm writing in the margins all the time, and I've just never found a way to satisfactorily do that with an ebook, because things get lost and drives crash and stuff. So I don't relate to ebooks in a dynamic kind of way. I love paper books. I love my library. I love my magazine subscriptions. There's a couple of different titles that I read voraciously every week or every fortnight, and I think that's important. There's sort of I say I never went to ebooks, but I look at things that some of my kids and young people are sort of returning to an analog, aren't they? They're listening to vinyl records, and they're buying books, and they're buying stationery, and they're having picnics, and there seems to be a real
arts and crafts are coming back.
And crafts, yeah. There's a real sort of value in the old-fashioned stuff, which I think So I'm pretty optimistic about this. I also don't, people. It's fashionable now to decry people that are wandering around glued to their screens, and there's famous Banksy cartoons of robot people. The screens are turning us into machines, and we're wandering around fixated to the screens. Well, I'm actually a bit more generous than that. I think most of those people staring at screens are in a sense, are staring at each other. They're connecting. Social media is social. I love it. It's clearly problematic, and I wish that social media wasn't actually profit driven. And I wish the richest people that history has ever known weren't making their money in the way that they do, but that'll correct itself. By and large, I'm a real fan of this stuff, and I see people on the bus. I commute many days, and I see people glued to their screens. But I think what they're doing is they're connecting with other people, and it's not an unmitigated disaster by any means.
Yeah, it's not. I mean, I see many people play a game. Many people laugh, right? Maybe they saw a funny picture of something online.
Yeah.
So it can't be all bad. But you're absolutely right. There are definitely externalities that people aren't aware of. Where do you think all of this is leading in the next few years?
Oh, God. Look, please don't ask me that. I'm not a futurist. I think that futurists have got the best job in the world, because they're never held account for their predictions. And I do like, it's attributed to Bill Gates that we tend to overestimate what will happen in 1 year and we'll underestimate what happens in 10.
Okay, let me phrase it differently. Where would you like to see it go?
That's I'd love to see a digital economy be a lot more orderly. I'd love to see these fabulous things that we get through social media and free search and free maps. We know that these things are not free. We know that there's an externalized cost. I'd love there to be models where we can still get these things at a reasonable price. What's funny is that most of us pay a ridiculous amount of money for our cell phones. My plan is like $100 a month or something. And
it's expensive.
Even if it's $50 a month or $20 a month, there's a lot of money, there's a lot of headroom in that fee for us to actually be paying for the things that we currently ostensibly get for free. So we don't, I think that there's a lot of room for us to come up with new economic models and treat some of these things as a utility. Clearly social media is a utility. It's almost as important as power and water and light. So it'll be a long term, maybe 20 or 30 years away. We'll figure out a way of making cyberspace like that.
Yeah.
I am beginning to think about critical infrastructure for cyberspace. I blogged about how identity is dead. I think the identity management has really sharpened our thinking around provenance of identity and provenance of attributes. And I'm beginning to think that this is not even about attributes anymore, but it's really about all data and the provenance of all data. We've got a society at the moment that's basically built on petrochemicals and the processing of crude oil, and we've got supply chains that, we've got supply chains that run petrochemical raw material and byproducts all around the world on ships and pipelines, and we've got standards and rules and laws for distributing that stuff. There's distribution supply chains for chemicals, and I think that we need to start thinking about what does supply chains look like for data and information, and how do we make sure that if I'm going to move data from one place to another and be paid for it, how do we ensure the quality of that data or the provenance of the data? So in identity management, we've been thinking about the provenance of attributes for a long time. I just want to generalize that discussion and start thinking about the provenance of all data. And then that would lead to a better imagination for critical infrastructure for data. Here's a wild thought. Poor old Equifax, people are running around saying these data brokers are, their days are numbered. But I actually think that data brokers may be more important than ever in the next 10 or 20 years. And it's not that they're too big to fail, but they're too important to fail. We've got to figure out a way of treating data seriously enough that we just don't have those breaches, or the breaches are less catastrophic. So there's two things happening there. If data is as valuable as, Facebook knows how valuable it is, well, it's about time that society and regulators knew the money value of data and actually made people invest in proper security. Security is run on the smell of an oily rag these days. What's a good example? The Yahoo breach with emails and passwords a conservative estimate is that data on the black market is worth several $billion. Just a couple of bucks per record, with 1 billion records breached. Now, what was Yahoo's security budget? It's a very, very big company, and they've got a good security budget, but it wasn't $1 billion. The security budget is tiny compared to the value of the assets. So there's something wrong with security, and there's something wrong with regulators' expectations of what a good security budget is. So, my response to the Equifax problem is one, the security budget clearly wasn't enough, or it wasn't smart enough, and we need to do something better about that. We also need to protect data so that if and when it does breach, we can clean it up, or we can neutralize it, or we can make data less valuable to thieves. And so all of that thinking, to me, very loosely goes to critical infrastructure, and what does critical infrastructure in the data economy look like, and when will we start sort of sketching that out? So that's where my vision is for the next sort of 10 years: regulatory approaches and better attention to data supply chains.
Mm-hmm. Cool. Yeah, I think it's a very important infrastructure that's just emerging still. Steve, do you think you'll still work with blockchain technology in 3 to 5 years?
Look, I think I'll still be looking at it as an analyst and so on. I think it's all going to die down. I don't think that it's going to be as interesting in 3 to 5 years' time. I just recently sort of engaged with somebody on Twitter who said that he said that blockchain in the next 150 years will be as important as the internal combustion engine has been for the last 150 years. And I quipped on Twitter that I think the next 150 weeks is going to be very interesting for blockchain, which is to say about 3 years. I think that a lot of things that we're seeing now are going to disappear in the next 3 years. I think that experience of 80% of blockchain ideas turn out to be better done with conventional technology. I think that means that I think that people will really calm down, and the outcome will be generally positive. There is a lot of reform and a lot of smarter use of technology that blockchain's inspiring, and there will be these distributed ledger technologies that are much more efficient than what we've got now. I think there'll be new ways of reconciling databases and keeping databases in sync, and that's plumbing, incredibly important plumbing, and maybe critical infrastructure. So, but I really sincerely hope that we don't have hundreds and hundreds of ICOs in 3 to 5 years' time, and people still this insane sort of money grabbing that's happening with ICOs. It's just abhorrent, and it's not sustainable. I think that'll calm down.
Yeah. Well, there will be natural selection.
Yeah, we spoke about that before. There will certainly be natural selection. Yeah.
Good. Steve, this has been really, really interesting. Again, I always love speaking with you.
Thank you, mate.
But thanks a lot for taking so much time today.
Manuel, I really appreciate your time and energy for this project too. It's just fascinating.
Thanks so much for joining us today. More info on our guest and our sponsors is in the show notes of this episode and on the podcast website, theblockchainandus.com. To help people find this podcast, it's important that you download, subscribe, and give it a top rating and review on iTunes or on the podcast platform of your choice. I'm Manuel Staggers, and I thank you very much for listening.